We are being lied to about the housing crisis. The answers we hear for why it's happening
is we haven't got enough houses being built.
Who is causing it?
Do you think mass immigration and a rocketing population might be affecting housing?
And how to fix it?
Let's just build some more.
Are all lies. I'm Callum, an architect here in the UK. I've been studying the UK housing crisis for 6 years now, but I have also experienced homelessness, not once, but twice. At 24, I completed my master's degree. I went on to get my first job in this career field while I was homeless. I was designing homes for the rich, not second homes they would live in, but homes they could rent out on Airbnb. Well, while I couldn't even find a place to call my own. The housing crisis isn't just something I have studied. It has been my lived reality. With that said, let's figure out and debunk the lies around the UK housing crisis.
We're not even building enough homes to cope with current levels of migration in the year to come.
We want to get Britain building again.
That actually builds the homes that this country needs.
Demand ultimately outstripped supply.
That the UK just hasn't built enough homes.
This country is not building enough homes.
I bet we've all heard it, right? The explanation that we just don't have enough housing here in the UK. Labour states that the Tories just simply didn't build enough. So under Starmer, they've promised to build 1.5 million new homes over the course of their parliament. That is the first lie you've been told. Starmer isn't going to be in power for 5 years. And Labour won't build any housing. In fact, no government since before I was born has really built any housing. Labour's actual promise is that through a process of deregulation, they will unleash the construction market to build 300,000 homes a year. This will hit Labour's 1.5 million new home target. Except one teeny weeny little issue. Even if they wanted to, which the construction market doesn't want to because of benefits from house prices being so high, is that it would be impossible for them to do so. Since records began in 1949, the private sector has never built 300,000 homes a year. On top of all of that, the majority of these new homes aren't even going to be labelled as affordable. So these new homes aren't going to be for you or me, as we can't even afford those homes that they label as affordable. Then there is the smouldering remains of a disaster that plagues this whole ordeal. How and why the Grenfell disaster occurred is because of deregulation. Yet, this is exactly what Labour is promising to do to fulfill this new quota, which will only inevitably bring more disasters like Grenfell while missing the impossible target. Hell, the planning permission reform that's being used to build these 300,000 homes a year is also being used as cover to adjust the requirements for data centres, meaning it will be even easier for them to force data centres into your town no matter how much you push back against it. So look, Labour did get rid of Section 21, but I don't think Labour should receive any applause for that, because groups like Shelter and Acorn have been working for years to make Section 21 so politically unviable that the Tory government was even progressing a bill to get rid of it before they lost in the recent general election. So well done Labour on doing something that the Tories were even willing to do. But Sir Keir Starmer isn't going to be around much longer, perhaps even by the time you see this video.
I will resign as leader of the Labour Party.
And we both know that Labour is going to be losing in the next general election. So what about the other side? What about Nigel Farage and his buddy band of bankmates? You've been told that immigrants are stealing our homes, the homes that of which building standards have been repeatedly dropping over the last 20 years. They belong to us. After all, we're British and they aren't. But if they're so poor that they have to arrive to our shores by dinghy, they aren't exactly going to be the ones buying up our homes now, are they? Right, you aren't worried about them buying up our homes. It's about them taking up spots for council housing or social housing, right? Your issue is that they are getting preferential treatment to council housing before British people can, right? Well, you've got an issue there, as that's literally not possible. It's been that way since 2011. Councils cannot provide council homes or social homes to asylum seekers. It's literally why we house them in hotels, guys. The issue that both Labour and Reform face about why we have a housing shortage and how they're going to fix it is because we don't have one. We have more homes here in the UK than people to live in those homes. That has been true since records began in 1996. I wasn't even born yet at that point. So no, immigrants are not stealing our homes. In fact, we could house everyone today and 1 million migrants and still have room for more. But for Labour, the truth is, even if we've been building 300,000 homes a year since 1996, house prices today would only be 7% cheaper. That pales in comparison to the same 30-year span. House prices have increased by 120% in real terms. We don't have a housing shortage. We have a housing surplus.
Still committed, still confident you'll hit 1.5 million homes by the end of the Parliament?
Still confident, still committed.
I'm just going to be making a guess here, but I think you probably know the basic economic theory of supply and demand. So you've just probably always assumed that this must be an issue of supply, not just because that's what you've been told, right? So if you now know that we don't have a housing shortage, what possibly could be the reasons why we have soaring house prices and ballooning rents? After all, it doesn't matter about how much housing I tell you we have here in the UK. Those things are still true. You feel them in your wallet, and they are the reason you clicked on this video. Nick Bano, a barrister who specialises in fighting for residential occupiers and the homeless, explains the reason for the house prices surging in the UK is because of a process called capitalisation. Capitalisation, in its simplest terms, is a method of calculating the worth of an asset by taking the yield of that asset and then comparing that against the yield of other forms of investment. In our case for housing, our potential yield would be rent. In the process of capitalisation, if housing and the rent that it yields weren't such a good financial investment, then capital owners would simply invest in other things, which means there must be something that makes investing in housing so much more lucrative than, say, investing in gold, art, or stocks. Bano explains that rents are perpetually rising, and this rise is incredibly dependable, which beats out other forms of investment. In his own words, house prices are based on the rising rents of an unencumbered private rented sector. Anticipated growth in rents is the index by which house prices rise so quickly and reliably, and those rising prices are the reason why there is such a high demand among buyers. Rising rents translate into rising house prices. This is the case for every home. A flat, a bungalow, a terraced house, a semi-detached family home. No matter whether you ever had the intention of ever renting out your property, the price of your property is based off the amount you could potentially earn if you were to rent it out, as every home has the capability of being rented out. Now, let's break down how this actually functions. Let's say you have a home that earns £1,000 in a month, so over the course of an entire year, you will earn 12 grand. Now let's just assume that interest rates are 5%. If you were to try and make 12 grand by simply investing money into a bank account, you would have had to have invested £240,000 into that bank account, meaning that house is worth at least £240,000. But housing doesn't just stop there. In fact, you can assume that house prices will just keep going up. So this year you earned 12 grand, but next you'll earn 13 grand, then 14 grand, then 15 grand. And that rise will continue as long as you see fit. This means that in 1 year your house price will be £240,000, then £260,000, then £280,000, and then £300,000. And this is just going to keep going up. Investing in housing in the UK is incredibly low risk and high returns, which is why housing is seen as such a good financial investment, and why so much capital is flooding into the housing market. Perhaps you have a mortgage already and you never rented, so you are thinking that somehow you managed to surpass this system. Well, the truth is, you don't own your own home. The bank does. When a bank was looking at whether or not to give you a mortgage or not on your property, it looked at how much yield it would earn from how much you were willing and able to pay for a particular property, and then it compared that potential yield to how much it would cost in form of investment for themselves, and whether they considered that an acceptable amount or not. The home building industry's profits do not stem from building new homes, but instead come from creating the conditions that allow rents to rise.
Of the homes that got sold off under right to buy, 3/4 of them are now rented out privately, and 2/3 of those tenants get housing benefits. So they're basically living in the same home that used to be a council home, but paying rent that is twice the amount, and it's being subsidised by taxpayers.
Rents must rise. That is a core pillar of Bano's assessment, that for housing to be such a prolific form of investment, which is causing house prices to soar, it requires rents to continually rise. And we can clearly say that in the data. Since 2015, the average rent here in the UK has continued to rise. In 2015, the average rent was £900 a month. But by February 2026, that price had risen up to £1,374 a month. I also need to point out that since January 2021, there has been a drastic increase in rent. Rent increased more over the last 5 years than it did 5 years prior to it. But if we want to go looking further back, we need to look at the rental price index. If we set the index value at 100 in January 1987, then compare that to the index value in February 2026, it has risen to 499.6. So in the span of almost 40 years, the average rent has increased by almost 5 times what it once was. Once again, I really want to point out the drastic increase in rent that began during COVID. The index value of rent rose faster in the last 5 years than it did over any period of the last 34 years. In fact, it did so at a rate 3 times faster than the prior 34 years. So Bano's assessment is correct. Rents have been perpetually rising here in the UK, especially over the last 5 years, meaning they've become an incredibly good financial investment. How did we end up here though? What happened to allow our rents to rise this much? This is despite the fact that our homes are just getting worse and worse. Because of the state, our government has done this to us. In 1957, the Tory government weakened the private sector rental controls, which had been in place since World War II. These rent controls basically froze rent to the same levels as they had been before the World War had even broken out. This deregulation during a period of incredibly high housing demand caused a drastic rise in rents. The average rent rose by 145%. Because of the removal of these controls. Landlords back in 1957, when they wanted to put up house prices, used threats of violence or actual physical violence to do so. But modern day landlords didn't need to do this. As in the 1988 Housing Act, the milk snatcher herself introduced the assured short-hold tenancy. This tenancy introduced the capability for landlords to evict tenants after the expiry of their contract with no fault required. This became known as Section 21. It was a legal right for landlords to make someone homeless. In the 1996 Housing Act, this short-hold tenancy agreement became the default agreement. Bano explains that this becomes a problem because there is a constant pressure from the private sector to increase rents. In other long-term tenancies, the ability for a landlord to increase rents is reduced. However, with this short-hold tenancy, it allowed landlords to exploit this short-term nature to increase rents regularly. In my assessment, one of the reasons we've seen such a surge in the average rent here in the UK over the last 5 years is because of the removal of Section 21. It was back in 2019 that the Tory government first announced that it would be getting rid of Section 21. However, it took until May Day 2026 for the Labour government to make that a reality. So landlords have been increasing rents faster over the last 5 years before it became too difficult for them to do so. Back in 1981, the UK introduced the housing benefit, also now known as the housing element of the universal credit, or local housing allowance. This housing benefit pays for all or some of a tenant's rent. Up until 2012, this amount was tied to the local market rent. Being tied to the local market rent is incredibly bad, as it creates a feedback loop, meaning the housing benefit wasn't just a subsidy for landlords, but it was one that was in constant increase. As rents rise, the government fits the bill. This was basically stated in 1991 by the Tory Housing Minister George Young while discussing the housing benefit. He explained that a housing benefit would take the strain when rents became unaffordable. This did eventually change in 2012, when the government finally reduced the rates across every area and capped the annual increase to match the consumer price index, even if rents rose higher than inflation. This, unfortunately, does not fix the issues that it causes. In 2022, about a third of all rent paid that year was paid by the housing benefit, so not everyone uses it. Yet, despite that fact, landlords will refuse to drop their rental price lower than the housing benefit, essentially creating a lower limit at how cheap housing in an area can get. And this amount still increases every year with the Consumer Price Index, which uses rents in its calculation, therefore continuing the feedback loop. This here is the other reason I think rents began to soar during COVID. In March 2020, when COVID began, the UK government, instead of freezing rents across the UK, decided instead to increase the housing element of universal credit by £20 a week over the course of a year. This amounted to £1,040 for the year. As short-hold tenancies are the default, most tenants are in fact on a rolling tenancy, meaning their contract has came to an end. When landlords who had tenants that were both on universal credit and were on a rolling tenancy, they simply increased the amount of rent they were requesting by the same amount of the housing element increase, even if the housing element wasn't covering the entirety of their existing rent. This left tenants in horrendously difficult situations. They either accepted this increase in rent, even if they couldn't cover it already, and received no additional help from the UK government, or they risked not paying the increase in rent and gaining a Section 21 notice, which would have made them homeless during COVID-19. This meant that the additional assistance that the UK government attempted to give to tenants was simply just a subsidy for landlords. You see, landlords' interests are fundamentally incompatible with everybody else's. Workers want high wages and low rents, whereas businesses want low wages and low rents. Landlords, however, want as high of a rent as possible. Since 1957, the UK government has backed the demands of landlords. By forcibly keeping private property so profitable, they have fueled the demand for housing investment. This in turn has caused the housing crisis that we know. Both Labour and the Tories are responsible for this housing crisis.
Housing has been the hardest one, I would say, to sort of get your hands around. You know, it's such a fragmented, complex, huge challenge, isn't it?
Look, the UK's housing crisis is incredibly complex. If I wanted to do it in all-in-one video, it would have to be days long. But I can guarantee you that we are going to be exploring every nook and cranny of it here on this channel. There is a reason that no political party, from the Reforms to the Greens, have a quick and accurate statement of how we would fix the housing crisis. That is not due to only how complex the housing crisis is, but because of how interwoven housing and landlords are into the very fabric of the UK. The truth is, in the UK, housing is not seen as a thing to live in. It is seen as something to make money from. Thus, the beginning of any solution must tackle that contradiction. In the words of David Madden and Peter Marcuse in their book In Defense of Housing, if a right to housing means anything, it must be the name of a movement to democratise, decommodify and disalienate the housing system. The right to housing names a direction, not a solution. The only solution is to struggle to make that right a reality. So the first step is to acknowledge that we don't have a housing shortage. Well done. You've already done that first step. And the next is to start tackling rent. About a decade ago, it would have been inconceivable to imagine Section 21 being removed. Yet it is now gone. Groups like Shelter and Acorn worked for years to make that a political reality, and they could use your help. You can go volunteer for Shelter or join your local union with Acorn to help them both fight back against this crisis. And with our collective struggle, we can force the government to fix this crisis. Many other places have, like Vienna with their red housing, or Singapore with their framework, or Britain in the past. Because we didn't always have this housing crisis. Back in 1979, the average rent in England was only 7% of average weekly earnings. We can get back to that. And exactly how we're going to do that is exactly what we're going to be discussing on this channel. So, see you around next time.